For all that we say we want new IP, we do buy quite a lot of licensed games. It's a fairly odd thing in the market. I mean, licensed games, they were all the rage in some of the earlier days. I think we then had a bit of a blip. Now, though, we're noticing a lot of licensed games. Most recently, it has been Lord of the Rings Gollum. Yes, because Gollum is absolutely the character that we all want to play. Yet, you take a look at this here, and what do you see? Two of the largest games, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Hogwarts Legacy, they are licensed games. And when we take a look around with the industry, what does a licensed game mean? Well, it basically just means you're guaranteed a little bit of an audience, a little bit more notoriety. It doesn't always work. Take the Guardians of the Galaxy game. It is actually, apparently, quite fantastic. But it ended up not really selling the expectations that its publisher wanted. There are notable failures, like with the Avengers. Right now, when you look at the industry, obviously Ubisoft have got Avatar. Everybody's got a chunk of Star Wars if they want. Amazon has got their Lord of the Rings MMO that they're taking another crack at. And over at Warner Brothers, they're going to try to salvage some form of money out of the Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League game that Rocksteady have been making. But our most recent one is obviously Gollum. It's the one character we always wanted to play in a video game. And yes, Precious, they hates us. Because it has not went well for Lord of the Rings Gollum. We have a 42 top critic average with 5% of critics recommending the game. Now, I don't know about you, I've watched Skill Up Video, I've watched, honestly, quite a lot of Lord of the Rings Gollum because it's very entertaining with its, especially its swinging animation where seemingly rigor mortis is the animation reference. That's not to say that there's bad animators involved in this game. It is to say that we should ask major questions about how this game was even developed, how it was made. And, well, I'll get to that because Nacon are, I think, not particularly good news. So, nobody really wanted this game. It was met with a lot of skepticism. Now, when you saw how this game was marketed, I mean, it was at the Game Awards, right? Sort of being pitched as, yes, this big narrative stealth game. And you look at things now, the UI that is very, very bizarre, right? You look at the animations that in many cases are insane. Here we have some broken human AI, and of course, Gollum, as we all know, he can fly. Yes, it's like he's got a wingsuit on. Very, very impressive for Gollum. Now, the game is not fun, and this is tricky because stealth is a niche. If you're wondering why Sam Fisher hasn't had that many outings lately, it's because stealth just hasn't really been the biggest game niche. And in the most recent Sam Fisher outings, it's been the likes of, not Conviction, but, the Splinter Cells that just got a bit more actiony. I still enjoyed those, but they weren't really like the original that we played. So it's in a genre that's really hard to do. And this means that Gollum was honestly probably fucked from the outset. Now, when you actually take a look at this, Daedalic are the people who developed and published it, and Daedalic are owned by Nacon. Now, when you take a look at what Nacon owns, generally speaking, you don't want to be acquired by Nacon. It does not seem to lead to good things. I mean, I'll mention it later, but for another Nacon hit, we've got the new Blood Bowl that is also sitting at a mostly negative on Steam. Now, this game had even more bullshit. So are you really going to blame the developers for this, or are you going to blame the publisher or, the ownership? And that is that, whether it's pre-order DLC or getting the Precious edition of the game, where you've got the likes of emotes, Sindarin, right? Having Elvish being spoken, an in-game lore library. These are a part, not of the base game offering. No, it's $10 more for that, which is absolutely insane. So you look at this, it's not exactly the genre of game that I think people would want in Lord of the Rings. Certainly not with one of those characters. It's a character, I think, where people don't really have any burning questions. We don't really care that much. It's not that important, the story of Gollum. And you end up in a situation here, as Christian Dolan, I liked how he put it. It summed up nicely the idea of a licensed game being made from the offcuts of better stories. And that is always where a licensed game, that's one of the number one pitfalls that you cannot mess up. Of course, this applies to spin-offs, it applies to prequels, all of that, and we can see that in so many places. If you're coming to this for the story, you're settling down for 15 hours of maneuvering Gollum through the jagged abstract landscape of Tolkien's waste paper basket. So ultimately then, it's a bad idea executed badly. There's no wonder it's ended up like this. It is worth saying, I forget the name of the reviewer for PC Gamer, I think they ended up giving it a 64, which does seem high compared to the rest, but it was specifically because the script was endearing to the writer. And I think that is speaking to the idea of like, real people made this, real people did try. But again, we must think about those circumstances because this was announced in 2019 for a 2021 release. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that, maybe this is in development since 2018, but it basically tells you that the people who are looking to make money off this game, so this is either Daedalic in, the wing of them that acts as the publisher, or Nacon, who of course own, the whole thing, they're wanting this out pretty damn quick, right? It then takes like a year and a half, 2 years for it to come out. It ends up being the messy, broken state that it is. I think that just shows there is broad dysfunction, right? It's like that university project that you did maybe at the end of third year or something, and no matter what happened, it was always up shit creek. We've all had that, be it, on a job site or anything, where it's like, yeah, this project's scuffed. There's no one person can fix it. It's just scuffed. I figure that's basically what's going on here. And when you look at a licensed game, what do you basically need? Now, there's a discussion to be had about fun. A licensed game should be fun to play. I would scribble the word out of fun out and say, a strong experience, because sometimes we go to games for more than just fun or something different. But it should be a really good experience, and it should be gameplay-wise, and it should be creating a fantasy that people want to play. That is where Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Hogwarts succeed. Both are pretty good as games, right? And they also have a large enough budget to not just capture a little snippet of the fantasy, but to capture the broad experience, right? The very broad fantasy of that intellectual property. Very much unlike Gollum, where it is a tiny little sliver of an idea from Tolkien's waste paper basket, as was pointed out in Eurogamer. So it's not really a game or a narrative that Lord of the Rings fans are going to want. Now, what do people want? Well, with Lord of the Rings, cinematic action, and a good example there would be the early 2000s licensed movie tie-in games. I think it was specifically Return of the King that people quite enjoyed. I remember enjoying that. The Ranger fighting orc fantasy in Shadow of War, massive battles in Battle for Middle-earth, series that I very much enjoyed, or to just live in Middle-earth, as in Lord of the Rings Online. Now, if you wanted to be a bit different, you could maybe, do a city builder managing Edoras or Minas Tirith, right? You could perhaps do something there. A Hobbit gardening sim. Like, you could go for a lot of those cozy core sorts of indie games. You could put them in the Lord of the Rings franchise and it would absolutely work because, you're capturing the essence of the Shire. So if you want to do a narrative Lord of the Rings game that feels true to the IP, yeah, it's your Hobbit gardening sim. It's not Lord of the Rings Gollum, a bizarre stealth game, if you get my drift. Now, of course, I talk about this. There is also the idea of just taking the template of a game and moving it over. Really good example would be Lord of the Rings Return to Moria, which is very subtly taking a bit of Deep Rock Galactic and throwing it into Khazad-dûm, which is a move. It's not the experience that I want. I don't want to play something in Middle-earth. I want to play, the experience of Middle-earth. And I think when you look at the great, a lot of the great tales, it's sort of a co-op Deep Rock Galactic game is not exactly what you're thinking of, I suppose. Whereas if you were to take a look at something like, say, the Vermintide series, that does actually feel quite at home with a lot of the essence of that intellectual property. So I think that with Lord of the Rings, there's been a continual lack of an ability to actually capture what people, what people really want to get. And then a question is, when you don't have a massive budget, how do you actually execute on a licensed game? And that's where we've got the very interesting sort of counterexample to Lord of the Rings Gollum, another licensed game that came out this week, which is Star Trek Resurgence from Dramatic Labs. It is the first non-MMO, non-mobile, game in the Star Trek franchise for years. Do you remember the third-person shooter set in the Kelvin timeline that was a total disaster? Came out, I think, in the early 2010s. That was pretty messy. But this is a weird one. It's a Telltale-style game. It's not not really that impressive in sort of a visual way or a technical way. It's definitely not the next generation of narrative games or anything like that. It is firmly taken from the late 2000s, right? Decision making, choices, that's basically very much Telltale games as you would have known them. But the thing is, it's actually hitting its niche pretty damn well. And we have this very fascinating Open Critic for, where it actually has a rating of fair, a 71 average, but only 27% recommending. Which is to say, this game is a 7 out of 10, but unless you really like Star Trek, it's almost certainly not going to be for you. That's essentially it. VG 24/7, competent efforts, but scarcely worth the effort if you aren't already sold on the license alone. That's exactly the way to put it. But for the latter, for the people who actually like Star Trek, Resurgence is the best Star Trek game. As an interactive adaptation of the popular television franchise, it succeeds. If you grew up watching The Next Generation, playing this game felt like returning home. So this is an example of not an amazing game, not amazing in so many different ways, but the one thing that it is actually able to succeed in is being a licensed property, which I think is quite interesting. Which is to say, you don't need that massive scope. You don't need to be hitting as broad as, Jedi Survivor or Hogwarts Legacy do. You can go in with a scalpel and make something very targeted, very specific, very cost-controlled. I think the basic principle is, don't make it be Lord of the Rings Gollum. That's just not a particularly good idea. There are other examples. Take Star Wars Squadrons from Motive, right? $40 EA game. Tron Identity from Bithell Games. That's another example. I would also point out the John Wick game from Bithell Games. That is a small game set in the John Wick universe, licensed tie-in, and it's really, really, really good. And actually, on that, there is a little bit of John Wick news for us at the end. But before we return to Jonathan, there is I think the curious case of Warhammer, because my God! In 2021, Kotaku did a fun follow-up to their 2016 article about the Warhammer just licensed games. Fucking insane flood of them, so many. Because at the time, there were 65 games in that universe published over 7 years. Now it's a hell of a lot more. Games Workshop, who of course don't make video games, they have a yearly showcase where they've, they showcase announcements, they reveal half a dozen games, and it's pretty crazy. And in spite of the insane scale and how so many of these games are total trash or mobile game bullshit, you've probably not heard of Warhammer Snotling Fling. But it exists. There's Blood Bowl 3, which, by the way, is also from Nacon, the publisher of Lord of the Rings Gollum. Blood Bowl 3 has not went down well whatsoever. But you then have really good games. Chaos Gate Demon Hunters, which for many people who like Warhammer was in their 2022 best games list. You've got one of the games I want to play friggin' immediately, Bolt Gun. Obviously, Space Marine, I absolutely loved when it came out. I'm very excited for Space Marine 2. You've got Total War, Warhammer existing. It just shows you can get great stuff within licensed properties. That being said, I think it is more natural for Games Workshop, considering you are, you are directly adapting a game and its overall fictionalized universe. But if you take a look at Steam right now, Warhammer 40k Bolt Gun, Starship Troopers Extermination, Total War, Warhammer 3. A lot of licensed games. And in this case, they're all games that are mechanically fun to play, that create a fantasy within the IP that players actually want, and they are games that are scoped to specifically deliver on that. Right? And I suppose what's interesting with that is, you look at executives banking on humongous games from massive IPs in order to justify their own development. There are cases that may not be right. Take a look at Suicide Squad from Rocksteady. That seems to be quite clearly taking a format of game that they want to have out there and applying it to IP that they have access to. So not as successful as a Hogwarts, as a Jedi Survivor. Whereas at least here, there's just the idea where you can have an indie game that will just, no one will know about it. But if you tie it into IP, it will be successful. I think Bolt Gun's a really good example of that. I have another example of that, a game that I've played dozens of hours of, which is Battlestar Galactica Deadlock. If that did not have the Battlestar Galactica IP, no motherfucker would know that game exists. But because they had the guts of a game that really fit this fleet command fantasy, and they were evidently fans of Battlestar Galactica, they were able to tie those things together to have a game that is, I mean, it's so budget, but it targets exactly what you want for that Battlestar Galactica fleet command fantasy. And it just works. So I think there are big lessons here in licensed games. And even if you said to me personally, like, hey, would you mind doing a licensed game? You know what's funny? We were always planning to make Pale Beyond, the game that we released. And we made that game, we were making that and had our early stuff in that from like way before the TV show The Terror came out. And through that, we actually ended up basically talking to AMC. Should we do a game that's like actually set in the Terror with those actors? And ultimately for us, it was like, no, we'd rather make our own IP. Actually, we'd rather do that and make our own characters. That will be better. And I think it absolutely was the correct decision for us. But it is that thing of like, yeah, we can make a kick-ass narrative game. If there happened to be an IP, the idea of making a game in that IP, if the team was all like super hype about it, that would actually be pretty cool, you know? So there's nothing wrong with licensed games, and I think for indies, they can actually be a real powerhouse. I suppose almost a weird parallel to this is what Riot's trying to do with Riot Forge, where, you know, obviously in this case, the IP is League of Legends, right? It's Runeterra, but it's clearly an example of like smaller cost-controlled projects where Riot just want to build their world out more and have people more deeply invested. And I suppose much like a successful indie licensed game, they're just trying to do that. Now, the final John Wick thing, it is that Lionsgate actually, they really want a big budget John Wick game. Quote, there's a ton of energy around it. So previously they had made a game with Mike Bithell and the crew over at Bithell Games. Now obviously, fourth John Wick movie, very big success. You've got, John Wick Hex. That was the game from Bithell Games. There's the television show, The Continental. There's a spin-off film, Ballerina, in 2024. And supposedly a fifth John Wick film is in development. I had heard stuff to the contrary on that, so who the hell knows? But anyway, AAA John Wick. Now, AAA John Wick, I bring up to actually say, is that the best way to do that? Because if you take a look at John Wick Hex, the gameplay of it, right? It's very much this kind of like very interesting active time battle system. And it's very stylized, which of course does make a lot of sense when you think about how stylized John Wick, the show itself, is. Now, if you were going to be doing a John Wick, you know, big, expensive AAA shooter thing, like, do you want to be going around playing as John? Well, it's like, no. Not everybody's like a FaZe Clan person. It would actually be quite hard to do a big, you know, John Wick sort of action game. But if you said to me, hey, indie developer, I want you to make a hotel management sim in the John Wick universe, right? You got your hotel, you got your assassins, you know, you've got to manage your reputation with the high table. You know, maybe you end up having this crazy fucking XCOM shit going on. I mean, the metagame loop of XCOM, not the actual, you know, combat of XCOM. You know, you can immediately see with John Wick how you could go for a really big and absolutely mid waste of money, big budget thing. Or you could go for hyper-specific fantasies that are completely, like, evocative of, I suppose, a certain fantasy that one could inhabit within the John Wick universe, right? You're broadly thinking about, like, the main characters there, because there is the John fantasy, but that's hard to do because you're not John Wick. The Winston fantasy, though, that's something a video game could pull off with a far higher hit rate at a far more controlled budget. So, interesting stuff as we talk about licensed games. A lot of this, for me, comes down to what is the player experience that you're creating, and everything must serve that. The writing must serve that. The game design must serve that. The scope must serve that. And ultimately, if you're just, it's like a video game movie that doesn't get it. You know, a video game movie that's maybe trying to be a video game, or a video game movie that's, you know, it's just trying to do stuff that's better done in a video game, or, you know, or vice versa, right? Where you've got maybe a game it's trying to do stuff, but it's like, dude, why are you making a movie? Where I think that if we kind of try to go for smaller, more creative projects, then that's when games as a medium can actually be a really beautiful tie-in You know, like, I'm thinking about this with John Wick. I'll tell you the closest game I've ever played to John Wick. It's called Pistol Whip. It's a VR game that you can play, and it's really, really good. It's a rhythm shooter. I'll just get some gameplay of it. Yeah, that'll do. It's a rhythm shooter, and what you can do is have like a decent enough auto aim to it that, you know, you will get your shots whenever you make them. And then you're shooting into like that rhythm, and kind of like those big club scenes in John Wick, it ends up being a very, I suppose almost synesthesia, like a very, very immersive, just fucking thumping experience. And if you've got a fitness watch on, like your heart rate will be firing up if you're playing this for an extended session. So this is an example of like, yeah, it is impossible to do Pistol Whip, not in VR basically. And this is what you would need to give a John Wick fantasy. So anyway, I suppose that's really my point here, talking about the idea of shaping a project to actually meet the experiential fantasy of an IP. There are times where budget will do that. Hogwarts Legacy is a perfect example. There are times when you have to take things a little bit differently. Okay, that's it for me. Let me know what you think about licensed games. And I suppose, who knows, did you spend many sleepovers just playing LAN on 007 Nightfire like I did? Because, yeah, I sure as hell did that. All right, have a nice day. See you next time.